Everyone, and thank you so much for having me over, as I would say, from the state of Michigan. And thank you for this lovely little February thaw thing, because this could have been like inches and inches of snow, which, as I tease my Chicago-based friends, like we get your weather just the next day. So I always think of you when I get bad weather. I want to thank first the committee for inviting me, and Darnell, who had to step out of the room for a minute, Beverly, who those of you who have worked with Beverly know she's incredibly organized, and all of you for coming today. I'm sure there's lots of other things going on just close to the end of the quarter. So I'm going to talk about LGBTQ student success through some of the work we've done in these studies. As noted in my introduction, I have a whole separate line of work that's just on student success in general, which I'm happy to talk about if there's time and interest in that. But I want to talk about research on LGBTQ students first. So those of you who've read in this area will remember that there has been a lot of work that I would call sort of visibility studies. So starting in like the late 1990s, there were a lot of student narratives and essays, like my experience as a gay student. And when we look at different kind of higher education underrepresented students, this is a bit of a pattern. In the 1970s, there were a number of publications like What It Is Like to Be a Black Student in an elite university. So the quote, visibility studies. So in about the 1990s, the LGBT, or actually lesbian and gay, sort of visibility studies kind of bubbled up, and you sort of see them in the literature. Very important work. It kind of creates a sense of visibility, and we are here. You need to take us seriously. Not typically analytic, but more personal narratives, both from faculty and students. So there's a lot of important visibility work. And then sort of following that, in the early 2000s, that field sort of got more complex, and then we began to see a lot of writing narratives about my experience as sort of, and then intersecting identities. My experience as a person of color who is also LGBT, or my experience as a trans person with disabilities, or sort of breaking it down and going a little deeper. Again, visibility, this helps people imagine their way into the academy in some ways. Lots of us who write identity-based work understand this experience of sort of literally writing yourself into existence. You create a space, and then you live in it. So that would be sort of the identity and visibility research. There's a lot of research on higher education campus climates. Even before GLSEN started doing its work on K-12 school climates, higher ed, and these typically started campus by campus, and they were often the result of a bad thing happening. So when I was at Brown, we had a lot of harassment happening, so we formed the Blue Ribbon Committee, and we did the study. This is very common. And there's a lot of great folks nationally. Sue Rankin at Penn State would be like kind of the leader in this, who've developed pretty standardized questionnaires and ways at looking at campus climate. Campus climate research is very important. It is not designed to be sort of empirically contributing to the literature. It's very much designed to improve what's happening in a specific campus. So that's an important branch of the literature. There's also work that several of us have done on identity development. Originally, those of us who work with college students thought about this in a very linear way. First, you realize you're not heterosexual, then you tell some other people, and then you come out, and it sort of relies on this process of coming out close to friends and family. And this is how we know how, quote, gay you are, because we know how out you are. It's a very linear approach to measuring identity. There's a lot of pushback around that. It's a very, not just Western, but very US-centric model in terms of outness as a measure of one's identity. And so there's a lot of pushback in looking at other non-linear ways, and much more looking at kind of what are the contributors to how people understand themselves and their sexuality. So in the field of higher ed these days, we're using much more interesting complex models that don't have a start point of I didn't know I was gay, and an endpoint of I'm in the Pride Parade, which is sort of another problematic of these identity approaches, because in fact the most developed point on some of them wasn't I'm in the Pride Parade, it was the point after that when you, quote, integrate your gay identity. So really the most developed point is not so in your face. It's a little easier for the majority to tolerate. So that's one of my personal problems with those models, is that they sort of automatically created as problems people who were being activists on behalf of their identity. And whether it was black identity or gay identity, those models would say if you are immersed in that, and if that is your lens on the world, you are not as fully developed as somebody who has, quote, gotten through that stage. So I have issues with stage models in general. That's a particular one with those models for me. And now a lot of the work has really begun in the last 5-8 years, separating out, really importantly, sexual orientation identity. Are you lesbian, gay, straight, asexual, bisexual? from gender identity. So for administrative convenience, many universities will put lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender together, but in fact our gender identity is a very different concept from our sexual orientation identity. You'll see in some of my data later that we have heterosexual transgender students, for example. So as we look at sort of separating out, there's some phenomenal work being done right now by Z. Nicolazzo at Northern Illinois. They're doing amazing work on trans college students. Eric Pitcher at Oregon State is doing some amazing work on trans students, also on trans academics. Eric's dissertation a few years ago was multiple interviews with 39 trans academics. And now they're doing a longitudinal study of about 45 trans academics internationally, looking at careers. And the really interesting moment that okay, so you're a trans person, so there's a lot of obstacles to tenure, but once you have tenure, you have more job security than almost any other trans person anywhere. So it's a very interesting, heartbreaking, enlightening kind of work that Eric is doing. And Alex Lang, who's now a doc student at Iowa, is doing some interesting work on gender nonconforming students as well. So there's some cool work kind of beginning to happen out there in that particular area of splitting it off related to college students. So I want to talk about the national study. And I was saying one of my morning meetings, so there is something called the Midwest Bisexual, Lesbian, Gay, Transgender Allies College Conference, the acronym for which is pronounced something like MumbleTech. So MumbleTech is a student-organized, student-run conference which now draws over 2,000 students a year. It's in the Midwest, and it started at Iowa or Iowa State. Some early year, its theme was Across the Fruited Plain, which is like my all-time favorite, gayest conference theme ever. The students at Michigan State University had bid for it and had been awarded the 2013 meeting. So in the summer before that, the summer of 2012, I thought, we're going to have 2,000 LGBT and allied people coming to Lansing, Michigan. That's possibly a first. And we should do something. That is like too fabulous an opportunity as a researcher to gather some data. So what are we going to do? Same time, that fall of 2012, as I was starting to think about this, I was introduced to Michael Woodford, who was School of Social Work at the University of Michigan for many years. He is now at Wilfrid Laurier University. He himself is Canadian and had the opportunity to get out of our country, so he did. Michael and I worked with one of our graduate students each from U of M and Michigan State to create sort of study one in this larger study. So study one, and the others that I list here were all graduate students at Michigan State, University of Michigan, and Wilfrid Laurier, and they are now out kind of around the country and around Canada as well. So we have some great colleagues out picking up this work and running with it. So study one was this at the conference. So we showed up at the conference with 20, what we then called netbooks. I think now those are passé and we just all use tablets. But so we borrowed 20 netbooks from the College of Education. We showed up at the convention center with them. We set them up and we had postcards saying, come take our survey. You can get a free cup of coffee and a chance to win an iPad or something. And we had 450 students do it at the conference, and they're like waiting in line to do it. It was fantastic. And then we also let them go on afterwards. We could tell who had done it before or after. So all of our respondents had been at the conference, but some of them couldn't fill out the survey at the conference. So it's definitely a certain set of, these are college students, mainly from the Midwest, who have figured out a way to get themselves to Lansing, Michigan. Some come in literally busloads from their campuses. Some come by themselves or the only one from their campus. But certainly there is some economic privilege that might go with this opportunity, as well as who is identified in a way that they want to go to a 2,000 student giant conference of LGBT people. But that was our thing. And then the end of the survey said, do you want to be interviewed? We had 250 people volunteer for interviews. We conducted 60 of those interviews, 48 of them during the weekend and 12 of them in the few days after, because again, we just didn't have time. So I had a pretty large research team doing those. It was really, really fun. And the way that, I'll talk in a second about how we selected the research interview participants. And we screened out, the first question on the survey screened out anybody who identified as both heterosexual and cisgender. So if you were heterosexual and cisgender, you got screened out. If you were not one of those two things, you came in. So this is a summary of our respondents. And there's a lot of conversation. I'll talk a bit later about, okay, how do we quote, measure, identify? What do we do on a survey? How does critical quantitative work when you need to ask people for their sexual orientation identity? We know this is fluid and changing, limited number of categories. So what we did was ask in 2 questions. One was check all that apply from this list that we have here, and the another identity had a blank space, so students could write it in. And we did have some demisexual, heteroflexible, a number of terms that I've not heard since, but were descriptive for those students. And then this data is pulled from the, if you had to choose one, can you tell us which one you'd want us to choose for you? So some of our data we can analyze with all of their, all the choices, the pick one choice, or pick all choice, and then the will you please pick one for us? And in fact, we didn't have much melt there. People were willing to give us just the one. So that was helpful. The same for gender identity. We did the same kind of question. And for the another identity group, non-binary, trans man as one word, or boy, B-O-I. So we had a number of different kinds of responses there. You'll see that about a third, so our survey respondents, about a third were man. And for reasons not clear to me, and I was kicking myself again for like 400th time. We didn't identify cisgender man on this, which it sort of implied there, but so about a third man, a little more than a third woman, and then a little less than a third were identities other than man or woman. And then racial and ethnic groups, 83% white. I think this reflects Midwest College Conference for the most part. And then we had a number of different racial and ethnic groups identified. And for the other identities, we had Middle Eastern, Arab American, Roma, Jewish, kind of a number of other racial and ethnic identifiers. So it's a moderately diverse sample. We also had students from 17 different states in the US and 3 Canadian provinces. We had a number of students who had been at community colleges before being at a 4-year school or never at a 4-year school. So we had a range. We asked for veteran status and disability status and a bunch of other data. These are just a few of the kind of key points. And then for the 60, so what happened was, at the end of the survey, they could check if they were interested in participating. We then matched that with some of their demographics. Over 250 volunteers, we took the first 10 who said yes, because it's a Friday afternoon, we've just set up all our netbooks, we have no idea what's going to happen, we are ready to interview. Like, let's take the first 10 on Friday, see what the demographics look like, and then see who else has volunteered, because we know we'll have a larger choice set. So that was literally, people were like, how are you going to pick? I was like, first 10 who walked through the door, and then we'll go. We gave them each a $25 gift card. That was a very nice incentive. That, I think, is why we got a lot of volunteers. They spent between 30 minutes and 60 minutes at their interviews. They were all done by 2 interviewers on my research team who came with different levels of experience to that process. After the first 10, when we went home on Friday evening and started looking at our respondents, we then looked to purposefully select in for trans identities, other than white identities, institutional types, again, looking at community colleges, making sure we had liberal arts. We picked up our Division III student athlete, Roma identified from a small liberal arts college in rural Wisconsin. I was like, I want to talk to you. You sound interesting. International students and student athletes were some that we purposely picked in. So we had a really nice, I think, mix in the end for gender identification. Almost exactly a third cisgender women, a third cisgender men, and a third trans and genderqueer. Our racial and ethnic identity, we ended up with half white, and then we were able to pull an oversampling to get students who were other than white identities. And then sexual orientation, these were the words they used in their interviews. So this was open response. The interviews were very open-ended, just kind of talking a lot about our focus on student success, and I'll show you kind of our theoretical model in a second for that. So that was kind of how we got a bunch of our data from 2013. So that was all in February, and pretty exciting for us. We then, then it's summer of 2013, and we're like, oh, this is really interesting. While we're working with these data, cleaning them, beginning to analyze them, what do we want to do next? And we decided that what we wanted was a longitudinal study, of which there are like none in higher education research on LGBT students. Very few people who study higher education, college students, that do any kind of longitudinal studies of identity at all. what we call identity studies in the field of student affairs and higher education I'm always getting journal reviews back. They're like, this is not about identity development. This is just about identity at a point in time, like a survey, right? Like, yes, not development. So we said, what if we looked across time? So we then went to study 2 while we're still working with study 1. And this was a longitudinal panel of incoming first-year students, and all from one university, a large public university. Let's call it Michigan State. And they were self-identified as LGB or T coming in. So it was a purposeful selection. We're like, let's get the folks. I mean, it will be interesting too to see who comes out in college, but we want to see what happens for students who are already out when they get there. They were not all out in high school, but they were out enough within the first 2 weeks of being at Michigan State that they showed up at an event or responded to an email or saw it on a listserv or social media and volunteered to be in the study. So we had this panel, and we interviewed them 4 times in their first 2 years, and then 3 times each in years 3 and 4. Michigan State students don't all graduate in 4 years. Many of the students are still in school this year, which is their 5th year. A couple have left the university. One of my favorite charming is like the young person who left to follow her girlfriend to Tennessee. I thought, honey, don't do that thing. They broke up, she came back. And as I remind my colleagues in student success work all the time, like, that's not in the models. You're looking at inputs around ACTs and SATs and SES, and what's really happening is that they're following their girlfriends to Tennessee. I don't know how you're going to account for that, but life is happening to people, right? But she came back. We actually had people fall in and out, and although this slide says 20, we started with 20, we had a few drop. We then added more back in years 2 and 3 of people who had started at the same time out when they arrived. So we wanted to fill the sample back up and diversify it because we were missing some identities by the time people were sort of dropping in and out a little bit. So we have, a little bit about the thing. We matched interviewers and interviewees, so they always had the same person interviewing them, so they built some really nice relationships there. And then we use a lot of visual methods in our interviews. So at the end of every semester interview, we said, bring us an image of what represents student success, or what represents success to you. And then we're going to talk about that image. We asked them we had them drawing on campus maps. Where do you, walk me through your day on campus, and where do you feel like you belong, and where do you feel like you don't belong? We did other ones of, the photo voice would be too formal a description, but taking pictures and bringing them back in, like, what are you seeing in your daily life around you? We also did some identity, different exercises to look at how they describe their identities in different facets. So we did some visual things. We have all those artifacts as well. Those were kind of fun. Thinking about what happened in Gayland between 2013 and spring 2017, we're going to get, this is a very interesting, every slice of time is interesting for gay people, but this has got marriage equality in 2014. We have the Orlando Pulse shooting. We have the Trump election. We have bathroom bills. Trans kids can't use bathrooms in public schools. So it's a very interesting time to be an out LGBTQ college student because a lot of stuff's happening around you in society. Some of it very joyful, some of it horrific. It was an interesting 4 years, I think, for us to use that. And we used those incidents in our interviews. The first interview back after the Orlando Pulse shooting, we talked about that. We said, what was that like for you? You were, you were doing your summer internship, you were home with your family, you were out of the country. What was it like to hear about it? What was it like to talk about it? Did you get involved in anything around that? So we were able to use those kinds of things that were happening with students. So this is actually, I went back, okay, so we started with 16, dropped and added up to 23 was the total. So we have about 180 interviews. I learned a lot about doing a large research team, data management things, like when we were finally beginning to put all this stuff together to look at some analyses, I was like, why does John stop right when Ian, okay, John and Ian are the same person, one person may, put the transcripts under the pseudonym, one used his real name, okay, good. But why do we have like 2 interviews for Jasmine for all of year 2? Jasmine is one person's pseudonym and one person's real name. So there's a whole set of like research team data management things that I was like, naming conventions for your files, start that at the beginning next time. Dang it was really something else. I was like, I can't believe I let that get away from me. But I did. So we've got 180 interviews, dozens of visual artifacts, a really rich, interesting data set that we're just actually starting to write out of that chunk of the data because it just wrapped up last spring. So of that group, we have, of the 23 that we have enough interviews to count, like somebody who interviewed once or twice, we drop them out eventually. So they're not in our 23. So about 9 white students and 14 students of color. The gender identity, we have more cisgender women than we have of any other group. Sexual orientation, we had, and this is, right, so this is like the challenge of a longitudinal study. I'm like, oh, you've changed your sexual orientation identity like 4 different definitions in 2 months or 4 years. So we decided for, when we write proposals and those kinds of things, we typically say, the start of the study, what was the person's identity when we started. It's not the same as when they ended, and that's actually we're working on a paper about that, about how that changed over time. But we're like, how do you pin that down to write about a longitudinal study with identities changing? So that was kind of interesting. So those are the 2 main studies involved. Any questions about that before I talk about the kind of the conceptual model? Yeah, Steve.
I'm wondering what motivated you to do the study, what were you hoping to learn from the data, the 2 studies? Like, did you have certain questions, or you were just waiting to see what would happen?
I was interested, so a lot of the research on LGBTQ students had been in that visibility and campus climate realm, not a lot about outcomes for LGBTQ college students, in part because there are no data sets to look at. So in post-secondary research, we have some federal research, federal data sets we can work with. They don't include sexual orientation. The UCLA SERP data out of the Higher Ed Research Institute, so Sylvia Hurtado and colleagues, those data only recently have included as an optional item sexual orientation. So institutions subscribe to that study, and they can choose or not choose. So they have a limited amount of data that has sexual orientation. The same is true of NESE, which is Indiana University's National Survey of Student Engagement. Institutions can opt in or out of sexual orientation. So there aren't a lot of studies that let us look at outcomes for LGBT students because we don't know who they are. The census, since the census, 2010 census, we were able to learn about like same-sex households. There's some ways in that census data to begin to look at lesbian and gay identities. It appears that college degrees are overrepresented compared to the rest of the population. So that would say, like, why are we worried about the gay kids? Because they seem to get college degrees at higher rates than the rest. It depends on how you think about kind of how those data pull out, but that is what the census data say. But it's really hard to figure out what outcomes are. So it's interested in outcomes. There's not even a lot of work on the effects of campus climate on retention. Like, we don't actually know. There's like theoretical links, like campus climate is bad, sense of belonging is not great, therefore I leave college. But it's not very well defined for LGBT students, more for racial and ethnic minoritized students. But I wanted to find out like what's really happening. Was a piece of it. And there's very few studies that compare across campuses, was the other piece for using the Mumble Tech group. I was like, oh, we'll have a bunch of campuses at least. Typically, these are single campus studies. So that was the motivation. And honestly, a little bit as, like serendipity, like, oh, 2,000 gay people coming to town. I should ask them some questions. That was a piece of it, just sort of some curiosity, like how would this work? And then as we started sort of looking at it, so those of us who traffic in post-secondary research tend to think a lot about what's happening in college environments. So we look at the campus climate. Previous literature really focuses on in-college identities, experiences, and environment. We understand a bit about kind of what's happening for people in their academics and how the institutional context is influencing them. Like campus climate studies often use the presence or absence of like an LGBT center as an indicator of campus climate. So we would look in some ways at what is there in the environment for inclusion and exclusion. We could look at engagement, like to what extent are students engaged in different kinds of things. Like the NESE data has let us look at students who identify as LGBTQ, are they engaged in undergraduate research, for example? So to what extent are students engaged? And I have some data from actually one of these studies as well about that. So a very common model in post-secondary research is something called the IEO model by Alexander Aston at UCLA. So we look at, this is very straightforward. I present this to my students, they're like, that's a theory? I'm like, not really a theory. It's like a concept. So inputs and environment. So we want to start looking at inputs for LGBT students. That has not been looked at as much in LGBT literature. Like we really have focused on the college setting. So we want to start looking at the goals students are bringing, their identities as they come in, the kinds of experiences they've had in their K-12 schools. Did they have a GSA? Were they out to friends and family? Did they participate in a supportive scout or youth or church group? Those kinds of things. And looking at how those inputs would affect their college experience. And then the O, IEO, the outputs. And again, this is very common work. That we adapted over. So looking at academic outcomes, so just saying, want to know what happens. What are their mental health outcomes? This partly comes from my colleague Michael being a social work person thinking about mental health. Social and community outcomes, like to what extent are they involved in communities? And then LGBTQ identities and expression. So the way we sort of embedded that using some ecology, which is more my way of thinking than Michael's. So looking at sort of embedding all of that on the national, state, and local climate. So that's where the longitudinal study in particular became important in looking at what was going on the national setting. And most post-secondary research does not look in terms of climate at the context at all. Most post-secondary research, whether it's climate for racial and ethnically minoritized students, LGBT students, women students, does not look at the social setting. It looks at the campus itself. So I think that's a real missed opportunity. So we were looking at, where do we see, might there be some direct effects and where might there be some secondary effects? Obviously, for example, your identity, LGBTQ identity coming in may affect your campus experience, but your outcome, LGBTQ identity, is also going to be related to that, depending on how you came in. So we're trying to sort of begin to look at testing aspects of this model. And this we developed with Jess Joslin at the University of Michigan, and Michael and I sort of created an LGBTQ version of this IEO concept. So that's where a lot of our work is sort of, I think it was implicit in our design of the survey and first set of interviews. It was explicit as we started doing the research interviews on the longitudinal study. It sort of came to be in that sort of summertime in between. Any questions about that model? Yeah.
In terms of outcomes, is there a reason why you're just looking at academic value and also what sort of job they get in their placement after school?
Great question. No, there is no reason. We could start doing that. That was definitely not in the data for the first one. We asked about their intentions. Are you thinking about going to graduate school? If you are graduating this semester, do you have a job yet? Those kinds of things. But we haven't, we still yet could do this with our longitudinal set pretty easily. That would make very good sense. I think it was failure of imagination. I was like, oh, academic outcomes. So the same way that I critique people for not looking at the larger context, sometimes I forget there's like outcomes of college other than like academics. What did you learn? Were you happy? How'd it go? Did you finish? Yes, jobs, that's a thing. I have to like make a note on that. Other questions? Okay, what we did focus on, and I would say jobs counts in that as a student success-oriented outcome. We were very interested in the academic student success outcomes, partly because this is where the national conversation in higher ed is these days. Like, it's around student success, and student success is defined in many ways. The federal definitions, the ones that are being tossed around, if we still have an education department today, they are tossing it around. They're getting rid of the post-secondary deputy undersecretary, actually, in the Department of Education, they've decided. Betsy does not need higher education deputy secretary. So looking at the national data tend to just look at persistence and graduation. Now they're looking at debt repayment, and job placement, depending on the institution. We were interested in academics in terms of their persistence. Are they continuing to stay in school? Also looking at their knowledge and competencies. There are a few national conversations in higher education around learning as an actual academic outcome of college, but the policy decisions are not being made about learning at all right now. They're being made about graduation rates, gainful employment. So we were looking at mental health and psychological well-being as an outcome that matters in success, both as an end itself and also as how it would affect other factors. Social and community relations, are people networked? Are they a sense of belonging? And then thinking about one's identity as itself being a student success outcome. So again, that is built in as both a a characteristic through the experience, but also as an outcome related to your success. So those were the foci we had. There are sort of negative sides to some of these, like negative aspects of mental health and psychological well-being. We really wanted to focus on moving the conversation away from, and we don't mean this in a, this is not callously meant whatsoever, but moving it away from the suicide conversation and the bathroom conversation. So often, research on trans kids, youth, ends up being about like, you need to just make bathrooms accessible. Like, well, this is about more than that. This is about how we use entire administrative systems to change life chances for young people, and how we could alter that. And then for a very long time, a lot of research on queer youth and queer college students has always gone back to, well, we have to do this research because we have to make things better because they're killing themselves. Now, it is true that research shows LGBTQ youth and college students have higher rates of suicidal ideation and suicide. But that's not the reason to do the research, right? Like, or the only reason to do it. And it had sort of fallen into, there was a habit, I think, among researchers, like that was just always the reason. Which sends a very particular narrative out there, because the vast majority of queer youth, just like the vast majority of youth in general, are sort of, are not right now dealing with those issues. They are like worried about who to go to prom with and worried about their algebra test. That's what they're focused on. So we wanted to move the conversation, not to ignore those aspects, and I'll show you some of our data that focus on the unhappy outcomes, but we wanted to focus on what are the potential value added. Like when a trans youth of color makes it to Michigan State University, that person is probably bringing with them some amazing assets, because how else did that young person get to Michigan State University? So thinking about what are the value added, what are the assets, it's like our bilingual students, right? Like, oh my gosh, like you've grown up to speak 2 whole languages. Like, we don't even ask Michigan State University students to learn a second language. You bring value and asset with you. So we want to focus on those as well. So that would be why these particular sets of things came up. So talk about some of the findings, and these are in a bunch of different places right now. One of the things we did was we built in, we were hoping to design, and we did design an LGBTQ. We're working on a separate trans one. At the moment, it's a college student sexual orientation microaggression scale. So specifically focused on microaggressions against LGBTQ college students. So we did develop and validate a scale for that is now being used in our own work, and others are using it. And then we related that scale over to health behaviors. So we have a piece on student smoking and substance use, and also on mental health, depression and suicidal thoughts. And this is not surprising, but the more microaggressions students are experiencing related to the increased negative climate, so the climate is worse, more microaggressions, there's higher incidence of unhealthy behaviors or mental health. But these can also be mediated by identity pride in both cases. So the extent to which people are proud of their identities mediated it somewhat, but not completely. So that was one of the findings there based on the microaggression scale. We've looked at, in terms of something, an ecological model, thinking about affirming policies and programs and support. We've got some pieces that look at all institutional types. We've got some specific work on community colleges because that was less studied. They also tend to not have LGBT centers as much. Sometimes they don't have policies that are inclusive. We're looking at buffers in the ecosystem, like how do these organizational features operate as buffers? And so the buffers can mediate the negative effects of some microaggressions, not all microaggressions. And they can increase positive outcomes. They don't have to be matched, which was interesting to me. So you don't need to have, you can have a buffer in one context, like a policy-based buffer around non-discrimination in health services, and that can buffer the effects of peer harassment, which really isn't about health services. But like, so it doesn't have to be a affirmative peer buffer to counter a negative peer environment. So you can have these sort of, there are actually institutional mechanisms and policies that you can do that will have positive effects even over things that are not directly related. So that I thought was interesting, because we sort of been for years saying you should, well, sort of the implication section of every LGBT college article was non-discrimination policy, start a center if you can afford it, do these 6 things, that will make life better. There was never actually any evidence that they were making things better, but now we have some, and that they can make things better in other microsystems for the student. So that, I think, was pretty interesting and important to me. also different from previous national studies use, and I had mentioned before, the presence or absence of those features as indicators of climate. I'm like, well, they're not, they may be indicators of climate, but they also are creating the climate. So looking at pulling out the effects of these policies and features of organizational life as organizational commitment to positive environment for diversity would be different there. So that's a few of them. We've done some ecological analyses. Jody Lindley at Iowa has got some work on LGBTQ STEM majors. Delightful, fulfilling your best and worst stereotypes of STEM, like, oh, it's a great climate here because nobody talks about anything like that. Nobody has relationships. We're all just nerds together. The fact that I have like identities and stuff doesn't matter. It's all, none of it is supported, so it doesn't matter. I was like, oh, great. But that idea that, it doesn't, body, mind, and soul are totally separated, which is a very UC thing, right? So I've told others earlier, my niece went here, she was a STEM major, she totally got that. She was like, oh yeah, totally. No, we don't do that thing. We just like have ourselves. Okay. So I was like, oh, okay, well, sometimes social science research just proves what we believe might be true. Yeah, everything's great here because nobody talks about anything. We just work 75 hours a week and we're great. We looked again more deeply at some affirmative policies and programs and supports, which are proving to be positive. Some great faculty research, both specific behaviors students talked about, and these came from the 60 interviews, like very specific faculty behaviors. So they're including it affirmatively in the curriculum. I have a course that has nothing to do with LGBTQ things, but they announced the Pride Parade. I was nervous to talk about wanting to write a history paper on this thing, and I told my professor, and he said, oh, wow, that's like really cool. So students talked a lot about the ways that faculty could be affirming in and out of courses where it might be a topic. Peers, the most surprising finding here is that LGBTQ peers themselves were often not supportive of other LGBTQ people. And so thinking about what are the in-group dynamics, and it wasn't just like racism in the LGBT community, but a lot of it was around, what is the word for, like looksism, around like certain body types, the way you were supposed to look to be considered gay enough, or if you were too radical. So there was a lot there around both peers in general, and some wonderful support from non-LGBT peers. Came out to my roommate, thought they'd freak out. They didn't. It's been fine. So some negatives and positives, but the issues that we learned about how students are experiencing the LGBT community was sobering for us. The heterosexist discrimination. Wow, I made some notes for myself that are hard to read. It's that the milieu is inescapable. So the heterosexism that's happening on campuses that students can't get away from, and I've talked about this with some other campus climate work I've talked about in the last few weeks, but when we ask students to bring in photographs, so this is the unsurprised, so some of you will have been in washrooms on your campus designated for people of different genders from yourself, so you will know this. Some of you will not know this. The graffiti in men's and women's washrooms on many campuses are different. Men's washrooms, from what I have now observed, and I actually walk into them all the time now, sometimes are filled with racist and homophobic and misogynist and horrible graffiti. Just nasty, nasty written terms everywhere. So I saw a lot of photographs of that. And then women's washrooms are filled with like, you are beautiful. No, seriously, like little affirmations written in these places. And I have known this from other work I've done on campus climate. At Michigan State University, where our longitudinal study is, in some classroom buildings, there's some student individual desks, those terrible tablet desks, I call them Catholic school desks, like, because they were like my little Catholic school classroom with like, they're in rows with the baskets under the chair, right? The tablet arm. We have a graffiti culture on those desks. And so you might be going to take an exam and your exam lands on the desk that says fag, right? So there's a lot of climate stuff going on. But women's washrooms, not so bad, at least at Michigan State. But this heterosexism, you can't get away from it. It's there all the time. It's not just on a football Saturday when the whole place is excited about men doing men things to other men. And women standing on the sidelines cheering for them. There's a lot of heterosexism that is just totally inescapable for students. So that would be one of the pieces. Cindy Ann Kilgo, who's a just brilliant young scholar at Alabama, really excited about being at Alabama. I was like, you are the trans person who's excited to be at Alabama. Good on you. Cindy Ann, they're from the South, they want to go back to the South, and they do love the football, so it's a good place to be. Cindy Ann's dissertation at Iowa was on high impact practices, particularly study abroad, undergraduate research, and service learning, and looking at the differential effects for LGBTQ students and the ways that these could be. Cindy Ann combined this data set with another existing data set to look at the extra value added. So if we can encourage LGBTQ students to go into these areas, whether or not they have anything to do with LGBT identity, they are getting more benefit out of it than other students are. So that's kind of groovy. And then in terms of outness and social acceptance, if you are out and affirmed and accepted, then your participation goes up in these areas. So whether or not, not specific to undergraduate research or service learning, if on campus in general you're out and accepted, you are more likely to participate in these behaviors that have been known to be good for undergraduates. If you are out and you are not accepted, you are less likely to engage in these behaviors. So Cindy Ann is looking at what is it about those settings, those pretty intense one-on-one faculty-student, study abroad, research, service learning. What about those experiences may be less appealing to students who are out and not accepted? Are they afraid they'll be rejected in that setting as well? So what is that happening? So Cindy Ann's delving pretty deep in that area, and I think it should be interesting because there are things we can do about this, right? Like we can do some affirmative recruiting of students to programs. Talk about, as the title of the talk, thinking about student success. In the longitudinal study, we have, in the 60 interviews, and then in the longitudinal study, we asked students repeatedly, like, how do you define success? What does success mean to you? What would it mean to be successful as a student at Michigan State University? We asked the incoming first years. Heather Shea is looking at student definitions, and based on the 60 interviews and the first 2 years of the longitudinal study, Heather found a lot of students talking about, I will be successful if I can make a difference. I will be successful if I can be an activist. These are the things that matter to me. So again, that is not going to show up in your basic student success literature review. Achieving academic and other goals, that stuff tends to be more common in the student success. Yeah, it's like, I'll be successful if I get a 3.0 GPA or 6 out of 8 in this class. Students talked about being who I am. I can be successful if I can be who I am. Again, that's not a lot in the literature. This is where the images were really interesting. So at the end of the first year, in the interview, bring an image that captures success for you this year. One student brought a picture in his a cappella singing group. He's like, I just, I fit in, I get to contribute to the campus, it's really cool. Another student brought a picture with her girlfriend, like, I was successful, I got a girl. And then one of my favorites was a student who brought a little video of her swimming in the campus pool. And I said, I never learned to swim as a kid, and I took swimming lessons in college, and it represents being brave and, trying something new. And that was what I was hoping. I came to college, I wasn't trying to change everything about myself, but I wanted to do new things. And I did that thing and I was successful, and here's me swimming. And again, that really caught from this idea that when we ask students, what does success mean to you? We are probably not going to get, contributing to the university's 6-year graduation rate. Or even early on, we probably won't get the gainful employment, although as we get closer to senior year, they're much more clear about that. Like, yes, I got a summer internship, which will get me the job to do the thing I want to do. Another paper that's Rob Hill's working on is around thriving. And Rob, they're using Sarah Ahmed's ideas of lines to sort of follow academic and social lines of students, and looking at thriving at school, like how do students understand themselves as sort of building and flourishing, or a couple of theories they're working with, in terms of my definition of thriving, and then a lot of work around thriving in home, whether home is parents or another community. And because of the longitudinal nature of the study, we are getting I wasn't out to my parents, I came out to my parents, we didn't talk for 6 months. I'm getting interviewed again the next year. My parents and I are talking again. And the charming MSU piece of that was that one of these kind of reconciliations happened at a football tailgating event, right? Like, which is just so MSU. My parents went to MSU, I came to MSU, I came out to them, they stopped talking to me, but the family always went to the tailgate together, so they couldn't imagine tailgating without me, and that's when we started building this bridge back. And again, as a not so football-y person myself, like, that's so MSU, right? That football would bring you back together. So really interesting kind of stories of thriving that we can get over time, and that's been really cool. Makes me want to do much more of the longitudinal work. I mentioned earlier Z. Nicolazzo at Northern Illinois and Eric Pitcher. They've done some really cool work with the trans students in the 60 interviews and then in the longitudinal work around trans kinships and how trans students are creating kin, whether they are slightly older or younger or peers in that setting, but that it is utterly essential in creating a space, even within LGBT communities or next to LGBT communities. So that's been really, I think, powerful work that I think is going to move in some cool directions. Like, how do we, in a population that can be quite small and not so easy to find each other, how are students doing this work and how is it contributing to their success? And finding kin being a measure of success. So I think when we stop to listen to students, so I'm encouraging a lot of my colleagues in student success land to be thinking about some other ways of pushing ourselves. Talk a little bit about what we're doing now, then open up for questions. We are the trans and microaggression scale. We're just like literally in the middle of, I'm missing a meeting on where they're like doing a bunch of factor analyses today. It was really sad to miss that. We're looking at academic outcomes from the survey data. We haven't looked at as much as the academic outcomes. We're looking at longitudinal analyses of identity development, kind of stretching it across, sense of belonging, disengagement with LGBT issues and activism. We believe we're seeing in that longitudinal data a lot of intellectualizing of activist experiences, like, well, I think I'm an activist, but I don't ever do the activist things. I was like, oh, you could be academics. We're very good at that. We got a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in Canada. We're going to study campus climate using these scales and others at every single post-secondary institution in Ontario. Ontario's not that big, it turns out, but we've got permission to do this survey, replicate it all across. The study itself, Jody Lindley is going to be the PI and kind of move the main body of the study over to Iowa with a really tight focus on newer sexual orientation identities, like asexual, among others, and then also on trans identities. I mean, so we're now 5 years after the 2013, there's been a lot of development in these areas, so they want to really kind of do that. And then we're doing some work with other folks really thinking about what does it mean to do queer quantitative work, and this challenge, we want to stay up to date, we want to change terms to make it relevant for students, we want to create data sets that might be able to be compared, a little bit at least. So we've had some conversations with Jay Garvey in Vermont, Sue Rankin, Noah Dresner, among others. About twice a year, we sort of get on a big Zoom call and we try to talk with each other about surveys we have coming up, what we've heard, comparing it with what they're doing with census data and others, particularly some sociologists doing this work. Like, how do we do this with ethics and integrity in ways that are good for research, but also good for the people we're working with? So like the GLSEN survey, which is a school climate survey for K-12, they have made a purposeful decision. They do this every 2 years. They have purposely decided to change their questions. So there are some longitudinal questions that you would love to be like, hey, 10 years ago, but what is it now? They're like, nope, we needed to keep the survey doable, and that was one of the things that went. But very purposeful to stay current with work that can be done to change schools. So there's a lot of really interesting conversations to be had about that kind of dilemma in it. And overall, sort of this tension that we have in the whole study about not working to reinforce the negative always, but create some space for positive outcomes, but also knowing that the negative is happening and not trying to push that away. So we're kind of in this, there's always a tension there for kind of all of us in this research team about like, yeah, we need to get policy change. You have to show people that things could be better, and you have to make a case for it. And we're not in a climate where making that case is very easy these days. So how do we kind of manage those tensions? So those are a couple of things we're working on. So we have some time for questions and discussion.